The Occult War, Chapter 4, 1848, the beginning of the World Revolution. With the French Revolution of 1830, the united front of counter-revolution was broken. France became a breeding ground for the kind of revolutionary ideas which ultimately led to the 1848 revolution, as people waited for the day in which the country would have taken a stand as the official champion of nationalisms and political equality. The causes of the 1848 revolution are so futile and imperceptible that it is best to ignore them and simply note that the revolution broke out because it was destined to. Ultimately, what is it that the populace of Paris wanted? It would be difficult to answer this question other than with the old refrain, it did not know what it wanted, but wanted it very badly. Apparently it wanted universal happiness on earth, but then who doesn't? The specific variant of this idea in 1848 was the happiness of others as well as one's own, meaning nationalism for those groaning under foreign yoke and democracy for oneself, since the French already had nationalism. The words yoke, groaning, and foreign were all treated as synonyms. Likewise, the word happiness was regarded as synonymous with democracy, republic, and nationalism. How can one be so naive as to even imagine that the common sense of the people, which is so adverse to abstraction by nature, drew this cloudy ideology from out of its bosom? The people is the same everywhere. At times it seems to show extreme generosity without understanding a thing, while at other times it behaves ferociously for no apparent reason, sensitive to the point of silliness at times, even when there is no reason to be moved. At other times it remains impassive, or even acts cynically when it ought to react, or even become enraged so as not to be shamed. The people is what certain elements would like it to be. Such elements crown the people, as they know full well that sovereignty will always rest in their own hands. This is the root of all infatuation with democracy, as was the case in Paris in 1848. The French people then wanted a republic. Soon after, it wanted the empire again, and war in the name of nationalism. Such was the plan of the international conspiracy. It was argued at the time that France was not a nation like the rest, that its own patriotism was too small for its big heart, and that the country had to embrace all nationalisms on earth, without actually ascertaining whether these were real or merely figments of the imagination. France owed this to itself, for it had inherited the mission of the French Revolution, and an honor of this sort justified all sacrifices. The happiness of men, people argued, does not consist of good health, well-being, or security. What a disgracefully materialist view this was for men who, in the name of evolutionism, claimed to be nothing but the offspring of apes. Nor, they continued, does happiness consist in the joys of the heart and spirit, this being mere sentimentalism, unworthy of strong minds. Happiness for them consisted of two things. First of all, in having politicians elected by universal suffrage, and secondly, in having politicians and ministers who all speak the same language. They need not share the same ethnic background, for they may be pure-blooded Semites without this positing the slightest inconvenience. In this respect, the nationalist dogma was most generous. Indeed, it considered it a sign of bad taste to even regard its policy as a form of accommodation. The great revolutions of 1848 signaled the beginning of the political, social, and economic rise of the Jewish people. Throughout Europe, the Jews became what they had already been in the aftermath of the French Revolution, citizens of the countries where they had set up their gold Bedouin tents, citizens on the same footing as actual nationals, Germans in Germany, Prussians in Prussia, Austrians in Austria, Hungarians in Hungary, and Italians in Italy. They did not become such all of a sudden, but only gradually, as one revolution was followed by another, and the new ideas became the statute of European countries. The alleged disenfranchisement of peoples and men was nothing but the disenfranchisement of the Jews. The alleged spring of the peoples was nothing but the spring of the Jews. So much so, in fact, that such words only have meaning when used in reference to them. All the anarchic developments of later democracies enabled the Jews to acquire greater influence and power. All the armaments imposed by the exacerbation of nationalism were a source of revenue for them. The taxes that ruined nations and men enriched the Jews, who were their ultimate recipients via the state. The Jews became the universal creditors. Tax hikes merely served to pay off some of the ever-mounting debts, while automatically increasing the wealth, power, and influence of Israel. Clearly, this went to the detriment of the entire human race, which fell directly or indirectly in debt to the Jews without realizing it. The wars and revolutions that continued spreading after 1848, which became an increasing burden on European countries, were but the finest of all financial operations for the Israelite gold peddlers. The Jews may have no industries, forests, castles, or factories, but they own the stocks, sponsorships, and letters of credit for them. Those who offend the Jews' envious gazes by showing off their own riches are in fact nothing but the Jews' taxpayers, one way or the other. At the same time, these individuals serve as lightning rods, attracting blasts of popular rage upon themselves and their tangible assets, thereby diverting this rage from the Jew, who remains undetectable and free from responsibility. When the gap between the wealth of businesses and the misery of the masses will grow too conspicuous or shocking, people will explain, by resorting to scientific arguments, that the problem is a widespread economic crisis and not simply the transfer of cash into Jewish pockets. This process unfolded relatively slowly in the first half of the 19th century, but since 1848 everything has been moving along with giant steps in this direction, uninterrupted progress indeed. The simultaneous revolutions of 1848 were exceptional events in both economic and political terms. Jewish businessmen never made a better investment. If, in certain respects, men came to enjoy a greater level of comfort after these revolutions, this was due to the industrial application of science, which has nothing to do with capitalist practices or democratic methods. The juridical disenfranchisement of the Jews and their acquisition of equal civil rights went to the detriment of their new fellow citizens. Something similar may be found in the Arabian Nights, which tells of a fool who opened a bottle containing an evil genie. When the genie was released from the pressure of the bottle, it grew to such a size that it ended up occupying the entire world and ruling over humanity. In the latter half of the 19th century, all professions, careers, and fields of action, with the exception of certain honorific offices of no social importance, were opened up to the Jews, who rushed to occupy them en masse. They fiercely competed with the Christian flock and gradually took over all the best posts. Russia alone remained closed to them. The outrageous case of Russia thus became the favorite subject matter of all Jewish-made European literature and thought. There is less talk of Russia nowadays, when the state of the country is enough to make one's hair stand on end, than there was between 1848 and 1914. This in itself should make us think and realize that, according to modern parlance, a state is liberal, tolerant, and enlightened when it honors the Jew, even if it oppresses all its other citizens and is headed by a new Nero. A state, on the contrary, is regarded as despotic, oppressive, and backward, and elicits feelings of outrage as soon as it seeks to defend itself against the Jew, even if all its other citizens have no reason to complain. Israel was never to forgive Russia. As soon as it had attained its goals in Western and Central Europe, it directed its efforts against the one enemy still standing. If the year 1848 was the equinox of the Jew, it was followed by countless April showers with great temperature variations. Still, it took about 20 years for relations in Europe to conform to the new order. Leaving aside the case of France, where the monarchy of the Orleans was brought down, this first historical attempt at a pan-European revolution initially seemed to have failed, since the old order was re-established. The overall plan, however, had been well prepared. No conservative state was to deal with its neighbor's revolution, for each had a revolution of its own to deal with. Russia alone was free, but had its eyes fixed on Constantinople, where the sick man was growing sicker and sicker. The Tsar focused all his diplomatic efforts on the attempt to ensure his succession and thus become the executor of Peter the Great's will. Britain held Russia in check. While neither side wished to wage war, the situation remained tense. This tension was exploited by the parties of subversion, which were hoping to avert the possibility that Nicholas might deal with the revolutions in Central Europe. The Tsar never intervened in this area, not even in Prussia, where the ruler, his brother-in-law, was facing a difficult situation. Still less did the Tsar consider intervening in Italy, which was far away. While in his heart he was utterly foreign to liberalism, Nicholas I did not possess Metternich's genius, nor his overall view of the historical chain of causes and effects. A greater soldier than statesman, and a ruler so authoritarian as to ignore all advice, the Tsar only saw what was before his eyes and never considered the possibility that the fire consuming Europe might envelop his own empire. Nicholas I, the man before whom everyone from the White Sea to the Black and from the Carpathian Mountains to the Pacific Ocean trembled, believed his empire to be made of iron. He refused to admit or even consider the possibility that the Judaizing liberals of the West he so deeply despised had already started digging his descendants' graves. He behaved like our contemporaries do and like Bismarck did, who nonetheless is considered to have been a great statesman. But the behavior of Nicholas I is more excusable, since he lacked the same level of experience. The Tsar was certainly capable of crushing the revolution in 1848, for he was still sure of the unfailing loyalty of his troops. However, he committed the terrible mistake of not doing so, and the price paid for this was the very existence of his dynasty and empire. The revolution of 1848 was the egg from which the revolution of 1917 was born, for historical events are always interconnected. Regrettably, the only people aware of this are the Jews, and herein lies their great superiority. In the life of individuals, families, and nations, there are certain supreme moments in which the future rests in one's hands. History might have taken a different course had Nicholas I, whose empire had not yet been affected by the surrounding putrefaction, resolutely stood up as the representative of absolute authority in 1848, just as Napoleon III was to do a short time later for the principles of the French Revolution. Short-sighted people would have accused the Tsar of engaging in a useless war. From a contingent point of view, it would no doubt have been useless for Russia, but from the point of view of the philosophy of history, as may be judged today, it would have been a war of salvation both for his own country and for Christian humanity. Only Nicholas I could have intervened and crushed the infernal conspiracy. What he did, however, was merely stifle one of its local symptoms, the revolution in Hungary. A Russian army led by General Paskevich got the better of it. The insurrection capitulated, and the Holy Crown of St. Stephen was returned to its legitimate holder, the Emperor of Austria. This act put the government of Vienna back in power when for a moment it had been thrown into confusion by the occurrence of simultaneous revolts across its domain. The movement was temporarily quelled, but the impulse had been given by then. It would never come to a halt. Politically, Metternich had no voice, an old man disheartened at witnessing the triumph of what he hated and feared the most in his last days. This great European, the last statesman to have envisioned Europe as an orderly and united whole, had in a way been buried by the ruins of his own edifice, the Holy Alliance. Only the memory of it survived. Its hour had come, and the only man capable of fully grasping the events of the century had nothing to look forward to but death. The old Emperor Franz had died. After the short reign of the weak Ferdinand, Franz Joseph, whom our generation has come to know as the Patriarch of Europe, ascended his ancestor's throne at the age of 18. He hadn't had the time to acquire much experience, for he had been caught in the midst of events arising out of democratic chaos that were even less intelligible to the men of his day than they are to us. This young man, who had been raised according to the traditional principles of the Habsburg household, was most disconcerted by the first encounter he made with the phenomenon of democracy on the threshold of adulthood. The impression it created must have been like that of an upside-down house painted by some extravagant artist trying to be original and shocking by inverting all established values. Franz Joseph's reaction may easily be imagined, especially because democracy at the time was still something new that found its only precedent in the French Revolution, a frightful nightmare which still haunted people's imaginations. People no more realized at the time than they do today that this was an attack mounted by a minority as small as the ruling elite and seeking to replace it. The so-called people was regarded as an actual entity which plotters and adventurers who were in the pay of capitalist anonymity claimed to be representing. The new chancellor of the empire, Charles Philip, Prince of Schwarzenberg, was less inspired than his brilliant predecessor and took the dangerous path of concessions and compromises. A similar approach will never satisfy an enemy who is insatiable by definition. It will merely show one's fear of him and thus make him all the more demanding and arrogant. One cannot claim to know what impertinence is until one has witnessed democratic arrogance and heard the unrestrained words of the blithering maniacs who claim to embody the mute and indifferent people. This regime, based on half measures, lasted several years. Finally, a parliamentary constitution was introduced. The Austrian state started down a slippery slope. The Jews were assigned full civic rights. All paths, except those within the imperial court, were open to them. From this moment onwards, the Jews anonymously began playing a conspicuous and dire role by hiding, as they are wont to do, behind the fetish of the people. The party of the French Revolution, which should not be confused with France as a country, thus celebrated a new victory. It did so in Vienna, the Kaiserstadt, which was regarded as the sanctuary of feudalism, which had been the cradle of the Holy Alliance. In Austria, however, despite political changes, the economic and social structure remained imbued with the feudal spirit. The great noblemen remained economically independent of capitalism and continued to hold far greater prestige in the eyes of the masses than the bureaucrats and politicians. Besides, on both sides of the Leitha, it was the heads of great families of impeccable lineage who made up the upper chambers, which were known as the Lords' Chambers. Things continued this way until the Great War, much to the indignation of all generous and enlightened souls. Austria and Hungary, not unlike Prussia and the rest of Germany, showed themselves more reluctant to embrace democracy than France had been, and Russia was destined to be in the future. No Louis XIV or Richelieu, no Ivan the Terrible or Peter the Great had sapped the lifeblood of patriarchal feudalism and domesticated the landed aristocracy. Gradually, almost everywhere except in Austria, this nobility had been drawn towards the royal courts, thus losing touch with the countryside it had once ruled over. In France and Russia, this aristocracy was replaced to a far greater degree than in Austria or Germany by paid officials with no roots in the country and ready to serve the highest bidder. The victory of subversion, while striking, was only partial. Planning to proceed with order as usual, subversion was satisfied with what it had accomplished and left the rest up to its ally, time. Things would have been much easier if republican and parliamentary regimes had already been flourishing in Europe in that age. It would have been enough then, with the help of the press and some propaganda, to fabricate the desired public opinion and instill it in the sovereign people, which at that point could have been exploited to demolish the state. Demagogues devoted to the cause would have occupied ministerial seats. By financial means, they would have nourished certain dispositions, giving the impression they were simple and spontaneous ones. This is how international capitalism manages to have all the wars it desires and prevent those it does not want. In order to implement this process, however, two things are required. First of all, complete freedom of the press, whereby no authority has the right to muzzle the press, not even when the salvation of the nation is at stake. And secondly, a republican, democratic regime in which the weak men in power have only a casual relation with their ministerial portfolio. The only permanent and hereditary ties these politicians have are with their own portfolios, or rather wallets, which is why they will say, "After me the deluge, as long as I can take enough dough on board Noah's Ark for my family and me." A similar point of view is more of an exception in the case of kings and especially absolute monarchs, for the simple reason that the state represents their personal fortune, power, wealth, and glory, as well as their descendants' heritage. It is particularly rare among the landed aristocracy of the old sort, whose traditions are not nomadic, like the Ark of the Covenant of the Old Testament. The fortune of these nobles consists of a sum of elements drawn from the national territory. It is not mobile and is not based on credit, which is to say on debts that make it dependent on its creditors. The above point of view, however, is quite logical and normal for scheming politicians, with no links to the soil or history. Men risen out of God knows where, only to disappear with their pockets full after having carried out the tasks allotted to them by God knows whom. To behave dishonestly towards his own country, a nobleman, not to mention a king, must be dishonest to the point of selflessness and stupidity, something rare indeed. To behave honestly, a tautempion of democracy brought him to power by an anonymous clique that collected him from a barn, if not from a dunghill, must be honest to the point of selflessness and self-sacrificing heroism. This is also an infrequent case. Men like Cincinnatus are the exception. Besides, even when they are to be found, it is not they who are brought to power and given any credit. This is why political regimes ruled by dishonest men of the above sort are so warmly praised by the men of progress, whose alleged progress is merely the powerful leverage they exert to the detriment of the blind masses. But up until 1848, this golden age of democracy had yet to dawn.